Last week, we went through a torturous time of talking about things that were going on and why we are where we are today. And I came to some conclusion that when we rolled into the 50s, 60s, and 70s, we came to a point where a convergence happened that is the result of the things that you see today and has led to the conditions that we were in. As the old saying goes, Americans' chickens have come home to roost. Now, I know most of you say, well, Jeremiah Wright said that, but he actually stole it from Malcolm X. The words mean things. I mean, if you don't know the meaning of a word, then why do you use it? If you only use it because you're repeating what somebody else said or what you saw on the TV or heard on the radio, then what substance or use does that word have in your using it? Because words have meanings. So we chose this list of words. And we say, what do all these words mean? We talked about sexual immorality, wokeism, cancel culture, political correctness, white supremacy, racism, systemic racism, prejudice, discrimination, bigotry, bias, hate crimes, critical race theory, 1619 Project. What do all those words mean? Well, when I decided to do this, I do now look in retrospect that I was ill prepared and I could not get prepared because this was a bit of more than I could chew. And I was doing it injustice, trying to skim across it. So out of this list, I'm afraid that I can't do them justice. But let me say this. In Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 9, a man named King Solomon said that there's nothing new under the sun. All these words that are being contrived and used are not new. They may be different words, but same meaning. So Paul describes for us, and my suggestion to my plight is that I give you new words. I'm not going back through those words that we went through and try to hit every one of them. You can look them up and you can understand them.
Your mustache.
Hey, Laura, can you mute yourself?
Sure.
Okay.
John said sorry.
He is sorry. That's right. These words that we try to use, Paul describes something from the Bible for us that gives us clarity of to why we are where we are today. Paul writes in Romans chapter 1, he writes to the Christians in Rome. Rome, the seat of the mighty Roman Empire, the center of power, money, and sex. Remember last week I told you that even when America was not free from England, even when the people came over here for religious freedom, out of New England came this elitist group that said that truth was more irrelevant and important than conversion to Christianity. Already before the country was formed, and a country of laws, a country of freedom and liberty, they were fighting this battle. But back to Paul. Listen to what Paul read, or listen as we read what Paul wrote to the Christians in Rome about unbelievers of their day. Romans chapter 1, 7 through 28. In this letter, Paul says, God gave them up. Now, just that statement alone ought to make you think, well, wait a minute. God says that he came into this, or he sent Jesus, his son, into this world to save this world, that no one should perish, and that all should be saved. So why did God give up? He gave some of them up. God says in Romans 1:7, to all in Rome, Paul does, to all in Rome who are loved by God and called by his holy people. Says that his purpose to preach the gospel, Paul does, for in it the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. Verse 17. He goes on to compare the righteous saints with the unrighteous Gentiles, upon whom the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven. He lists the works of unrighteous who have incurred God's wrath, and then he says that God gave them over. What did he give them over to? Three things. Of the most popular English versions of the Bible today in use, this new NIV and the New American Standard Bible, which uses the phrase God gave them over. But most modern Bibles versions say God gave them up. The Greek word translated gave over or gave up means surrendered, yielded up, entrusted, or transmitted. In this context, it refers to the act of God completely abandoning the unrighteous. As the wicked deserted God, God in turn deserted them, no longer giving them divine direction or restraint, but allowing them to corrupt themselves as they wished, because they would not honor him. He let them do what they pleased to dishonor themselves. Being given over or yielded up to one's sinful desires is a judgment from God. Who was it that God gave over? The ungodly, the unrighteous. It says the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness, and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. We have talked much about the information we get nowadays, that it is laced with lies and falsehoods. It's just what God says here. It's what they give up. Those who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Romans 1:18. These are the godless and wicked, those who reject the truths that God makes plain to them about himself. They know God exists, and they are without excuse in their active suppression of the truth. Verse 20. They do not acknowledge or honor God, nor are they grateful to him. Their thinking becomes futile. They cannot reason. Their hearts become dark, lacking the light of God. Verse 21. They claim to be wise, but actually they're fools. They worship the creature rather than God, the creator. They worship the power of money, and money is the root of many evils. What was it that God gave them over to? What's the three mantras for what's going on today and what's gone on since Solomon's time? Power, money, and sex. What did God give them over to? Paul specifies three things to which God surrendered the wicked: to sexual impurity for degrading their bodies with one another, giving their hearts sinful desires free rein. The wicked degraded themselves in sexual immorality. Secondly, to shameful lusts. Both men and women abandoned the natural sexual functions and committed homosexual acts. Three, to a depraved mind. The result is that they do what ought not to be done. The depraved mind without the light of God will naturally run to evil, and unless divinely checked, will work out the full extent of its depravity. Why did God give them over? God gave them over to these things because of the choice they made to reject knowledge of God in creation, to refuse to draw obvious conclusions from the evidence all around them of the existence of God and his attributes, to decline to give God thanks, and to exchange the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mortal human beings, birds, animals, reptiles. All through history, foolish men have attempted to bring God down to their level, portraying him in various images and worshiping created things rather than the creator. It's a direct violation of the first two Ten Commandments. Their minds rejected proof they had of divine nature. So, as just punishment, God abandoned them to their minds, incapable of grasping the truth. If a person lies long enough, they lose conviction. And once lost, they become incapable of grasping the truth. What's the result of God having given them over? They have become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips, slanderers, God haters, arrogant, boastful, and they invent ways of doing evil. They disregard our ancestors. They have no understanding, no fidelity, no love, and no mercy, although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death. They not only continue to do these things, but also approve of those who practice them. Romans 1:29 through 32. In the outworking of the depravity of the human heart, the contrast between light and darkness becomes more apparent. This is the verdict. Light has come into the world. Jesus Christ came. But people love darkness instead of light because their deeds are evil. John 3:19. As the Gentiles refused to keep God in their knowledge, they committed crimes against reason, and against their own welfare, and God gave them over. Sad fact is that sometimes God gives us what we want. God allowed the Israelites who rebelled to reap the natural consequences of their choice. But my people would not listen to me. Israel would not submit to me, so I gave them over to their stubborn hearts to follow their own devices. In Romans 1, Paul shows how the wicked made a choice to reject God, and that choice set them on a downward spiral, increasing darkness and decreasing hope. As the godless run further and further from God, God intervenes less and less. Get this. The Spirit, the Holy Spirit's restraint on sin is a blessing. And if that restraint is removed, all wickedness follows. As I said before, I realized I could not cover the list of words, each one, and do them justice. However, I thought all about the riots of the last 2 years that have happened in our cities. Perhaps what we saw on our TVs deserves a name. Maybe we can call it systemic outrage. In front of the Capitol building in 2019, an unusual group of protesters were standing there protesting. But there wasn't any calls for passage of a particular bill or attention to a certain issue. Instead, they wore shirts that simply read, "Stay outraged," along with matching assortment of signs and buttons that appeared to be professionally crafted from an established vendor, not purchased from some ragtag print shop. The meaning of their slogan, "Stay outraged," what does that mean? Why not instead rally around a slogan that more accurately depicted what they protested or advocated for, assuming they had one? What drew these young people to the slogan, and more importantly, to the notion that staying outraged was the desired end goal? Perhaps, but unlikely. It was more likely that this small group of activists was born of a larger cultural paradigm, one that has permeated our media, national discourse, and everything we see of late. All those words we talked about. It was far more likely that the antagonistic headlines of the last few years had finally succeeded in manipulating the behaviors and emotions of our citizens and directed these activists to the steps of the Capitol to encourage others along the same path of indignation and everlasting anger. This aimless rage was deliberately designed, intended to produce this exact result. While the America of our ancestors was being transformed by the boomers, were indulged in their prosperity, and their children were being indoctrinated, and they didn't even know it. It's important to stay outraged, was the slogan. The title of a 2019 op-ed, in the hope that their readers would not fall back into the complacency of their cheerful daily routines. "Get outraged and stay outraged," exclaimed another headline, equally desperate for sustained irritation. "Never lose your sense of outrage," tweeted Senator Bernie Sanders, knowing the most effective political manipulation is achieved by raw emotion. One recent op-ed acknowledged the psychological tax of outrage, giving a more in-depth advice, like on how to hashtag stay outraged without losing your mind. Self-care lesson for resistance. Outrage is vogue, they proclaim, and more than that, it is necessary. But this story of unrelenting rage goes far beyond the abstract sloganeering of politicians and media. "Stay outraged" is also sprawled on t-shirts and stickers and buttons for sale across the internet, as these young activists have clearly discovered. It's a peculiar thought, this notion that if only you were sufficiently informed, aware, woke, that you would have a duty to exhibit an intense state of fury. It must, not only that, but once you've achieved an enlightened state of madness, then you must stay that way, perhaps forever. Being a normal person with normal concerns, you may read these headlines with a healthy skepticism, if not outright confusion. Don't we live in the most prosperous nation on earth with quality of life and freedoms that are the envy of the world? But those protesters would respond, the outrage. This is just the proof you aren't paying attention. If you only knew the truth and the depths of the disaster and despair and injustice in our mindset, you'd rush to join the mob in righteous cultural warfare, scream slogans in solidarity, march arm in arm to cancel those who disobey, destroy the careers of those who misspeak, and pile on to those who dare to defend anything other than outrage orthodoxy. Burn, pillage, and get away with it. Chaos, Clower and Pitton. Bottom up, top down. That's the way to take over a country. Bottom up, top down. When the bottom causes chaos, when there's nothing but outrage, pillage, burning, destruction, the people in the middle will scream, help, help. And the top will say, okay, we'll smash them, but here's what you have to give up. And the top comes down and they crush the bottom. But then we belong to the top. Outrage is a peculiar idea, but it seems to be working. But you know, there's a weakness to this. You've run into this. It's happened to all of us. For instance, let's say that you know someone and you particularly like this person, but this person has a habit of speaking with foul language. In other words, you have a choice of a certain word that we all don't want to use. Now, why do they do that? Why do you look at that and say, well, that's terrible? Because they are trying to put an emphasis on something. I've always had the thought, if someone has to use that kind of language, and we've come down to now being able to talk about it in letters, but somebody, then they have a deficiency. And that deficiency is in the use of the language. Are you not articulate enough to describe your thoughts without using that? Or do you have to have that to make a person alert so they can take in what you're trying to tell them? It is a weakness. It is the muting of rational thinking and the triumph of emotion. Despite what you've been hearing and seeing of late, it's not a virtue. It is not something to be celebrated, nor praised, nor aspired to. It's a deeply human emotion, even understandable at times, but rarely is it productive. Rarely is it virtuous or useful. It is an emotion to overcome, not accept. And overcoming it requires mental strength. What we mean by outrage is a specific term with a specific meaning. Not all forms of outrage are unjustified. Far from it. Jesus, Matthew 21:12, John 2:18, was in the courtyard, and the money changers were doing their deal. And he became indignant, outrage, formed a whipped the animals, turned the tables over. We call that righteous indignation. And nobody had any more right to do it than Jesus Christ. This is not about proper outrage stemming from real tragedy or wrongdoing or injustice. This is not about overcoming true grief. It's about outrage culture and the newfound tendency to flexibly assume the worst of intentions when reacting to news or commentary or political discourse and default into emotional driven hatred of whoever's given it, whoever that might be. It is petty, weak-minded, and ultimately unproductive response to our neighbors, our fellow citizens, and political opponents that has been normalized and even elevated in our culture. We got a problem. It is about a hypersensitivity that has infected our society where undesirable language is the equivalent of physical violence, where an old tweet or a Facebook post can be grounds for ruination and a public shame, and where absence of reason or fact encourages public indictment, moral outrage, and mob rule. Outrage culture is a weaponization of emotion and the elevation of emotion above reason. It is the new normal, where moral righteousness rises to proportion to your level of outrage. The more outraged one is, the more authentic one is perceived to be. And the more authentic one is, the greater one's moral standing. Reason, rationale, and evidence, the heck with it. Why have these things accelerated to this level so rapidly? It's anyone's guess, but I have an idea. Internet, social media, transformed incentives within mainstream media reporting are a good place to start. What used to be rare instances of political correctness and microaggressions and irrational anger have mystitized into the outrage culture we see today, characterized not just by outrage and political correctness, but also by identity politics and an increasingly polarizing media and digital environment. Common enemy, identity politics, when combined with microaggression, produces a call-out culture in which almost anything one says or does can result in public shaming. Add in the element of anonymous information inherent in social media comments, and you have the ingredients for a toxic mob politics culture. This mob, unshackled by the interpersonal limitations of good manners, won't let progressive leaders, even like former President Barack Obama, they won't let them off the hook. The New York Times opinion section pounced on the former president after he made this all too sensible observation on cancel culture. Obama said, I can sit and feel pretty good about myself because, man, you see how woke I was? I called you out. That's not activism. That's not bringing about change. If all you're doing is casting stones, you're probably not going to get that far. That's easy to do. Then a young columnist in the Times dismissed President Obama as an out of touch boomer for those comments. For the columnist, it was a foolish, emotional reaction to sensible remarks by a former president. And it isn't just millennials and Gen Z. The entire U.S. political system seems to be infected by these problematic cultural trends cheered on by the media and opinion journalists who thrive on drama and conflict and strife, knowing that the most salacious headlines will get most clicks. Journalists are all too happy to oblige. As Jeffrey Berry of Tufts University notes when he writes The Outrage Industry, he says, outrage speech designed not for substance, but for emotional response. Not for substance, but for the emotional response. In Hate Incorporated magazine, Matt Tabbitt says that this is partly because the financial incentives for incendiary opinion journalism is so strong. There's a financial pull towards research-free stories. Give you an example. Writing 1,200 words of jokes about a Trump tweet costs less than sending a reporter undercover into the Mexican cartel. There it is. You can produce this by just reproducing the tweet and making fun of it, and it doesn't cost you anything. But it costs you a bunch of money to infiltrate the cartel that's putting drugs into our country. That's the kind of reporting we see. It has grown terribly difficult to separate objective journalism from opinion journalism. Back in the days of the evening news, when Walter Cronkite come on the TV, he was considered the most trusted man in America. There was a well-defined separation between news and opinion. However, Walter Cronkite was a big liberal, but he didn't allow his opinions to come into the news. Today, they have bled into each other just like water flowing into a bucket. This exacerbates division and resentment. Whereas all of us has known for a long time, Fox News leans right, MSNBC leans left, and the rest of the news networks still try to pass themselves off as objective nonpartisans. This frustrates conservatives the most, since networks like CNN still proclaim to be just the facts or news analysis, when in fact most hosts persistently engage in left-leaning opinion journalism. It's no wonder that trust in media has been edging lower and lower for the past 20 years. I think that it may race the Oscar event to see who can get the lowest. Because I think the Oscar event now has become somewhere in the single digits. And media is closely approaching. This has deeper consequences than just heightened social tensions. These problematic cultural trends and misleading media practices are changing the actual values we deem to be good. And we talked about them last week. See, our culture has come to view heroes the figures and the attributes that we should emulate differently. And that's a problem. A classic view of a hero type would be a person who is calm, collected, and self-assured. A person raised on the mantra of sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Or the great Rudyard Kipling line, if you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you. Of course, few people have an honest claim to such virtue. We're all prone to overreaction and emotional reasoning, but the point is that we strive to be better. Whereas those who God has given up on strive to be worse. It seems that the hero type has lost standing in its own antithesis. Righteous outrage, emotional reaction, moral grandstanding. The new hero is the one who speaks truth to power. That's a really tired cliche, which has a very elusive definition. And it signals their oppression loudly, ready to bravely point out how others have wronged them. Where the bravery is the scenario in this is beyond me. People believe it nonetheless. It's an indication that certain versions of heroic attributes like being brave and outspoken are still valued, though their meaning has been twisted to accommodate what is clearly a victimhood mentality. And why not? In this day of age of victimhood is power. As society, we may have finally reached a point where we realize something is a little off. The tragedy has grown out of control, often to the expense of logic, decency, and virtue. We aren't acting the way we're supposed to. We mock virtue without considering how its abandonment accelerates our moral decay. We aren't acting as a culture that is mature and enlightened or educated. We're acting not worthy of this beautiful country and political system that we inherited from our revolutionary ancestors. Rather, we put on a mantle of fragility, of anger, of childishness, and are utterly shameless in doing it. The consequences of this decay are many, but ultimately, it's a question of sustainability. How long can our society endure when we are at each other's throats? We don't want to know the answer to that question. We want to know how to fix it. Only God can fix it. God hasn't given us up, not all of us. If God chooses to have it fixed, he will use the faithful to change our nation. These may be among those of us, these may be the next Billy Sunday or D.L. Moody or Billy Graham that will lead us into the fifth great awakening. That says if we, the people, will turn from our wicked ways and pray to God, he will hear us in heaven and our prayers, and he'll hear our prayers and heal our nation. Know enough of these words in your reaction to and interaction with the people of this world. It may take you to sit down and find out what cancel culture is. It may take you to sit down and understand what 1619 Project is. It may take you to understand wokeism. But understand enough of it to ask one question. Because when you're confronted by an unbeliever, by a person who pushes this, then you should say to them in a very non-confrontational way, Could you explain that to me? And then you have your one question. And your one question could be enough to be a crack in the door to explaining something far more important to these people. The eternal existence of their soul. Let me close by saying that millions have given their lives for this country and for freedom over the past 250 years. Think about that. People have actually died for freedom. For you, for me. But one person gave his life for the entire world, past, present, and future. That whoever believes in him shall be saved and truly free for all eternity. Isn't that worth standing up for? We're in a fight. There's one thing that's true about this fight. We're on the right side of it. We're on God's side. And all God's people said,